something seismic just happened, and most of America is only seeing the smoke, not the fire underneath it. In a dramatic geopolitical development, Iran, China, and Russia formally signed a comprehensive strategic pact, marking one of the most consequential shifts in 21st century international relations. And if you think this is just another diplomatic headline buried under the noise of cable news, then you're being played. This is the story that defines the next chapter of global power. And it begins right now in real time, with consequences that will touch your economy, your security, your daily life, and the world your children are going to inherit. The pact comes against the backdrop of decades of growing cooperation between these three states. Iran and Russia earlier concluded a 20-year comprehensive strategic partnership treaty designed to deepen economic, political, and defense ties and to blunt the impact of Western sanctions, a treaty signed in January 2025. What you are watching is not an accident. It is not improvised. It is the deliberate construction of a counter-architecture to everything the United States has built since the end of World War II. The rules-based international order, that phrase Washington loves to repeat, is being challenged not with ideology, but with cold, calculated, pragmatic power. Three civilizations, three nuclear-capable states, one unified strategic front. And Washington, right now, is standing in the middle of a fire it helped ignite, watching the map of the world redraw itself in real time. The Iran war is not a discrete military event. It is a systemic rupture that accelerates regional destabilization, undermines United States strategic coherence, and deepens global fragmentation. The more consequential effect is strategic. The war is accelerating the consolidation of the Russia-China partnership, reversing a half-century of American grand strategy. Think about that for a moment. Half a century. Every administration since Nixon, from Kissinger's triangular diplomacy to Obama's pivot to Asia, every single one of them operated on the foundational assumption that you never let Russia and China stand together. That was the cardinal rule. And right now, that rule is being shattered, not slowly, not quietly, but loudly in the middle of a war that the United States walked into without a clear exit and without fully calculating who else was sitting at the table. On the morning of February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a massive joint air campaign targeting Iranian nuclear facilities, ballistic missile infrastructure, and senior leadership compounds in Tehran and major provincial hubs. That date is going to be remembered by historians the way August 1914 is remembered, not because the bombs fell, but because of what those bombs set in motion. Because when you strike a country that has already embedded itself into a trilateral strategic framework with two permanent members of the UN Security Council, you are not just striking that country. You are sending a message to Moscow and Beijing simultaneously. And the message they received is not the one Washington intended to send. Russia and China, Tehran's two most powerful diplomatic partners, labeled the US-Israeli war on Iran a clear violation of international law. President Vladimir Putin called the assassination of Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei a cynical violation of all norms of human morals. Russia and China jointly requested an emergency meeting of the United Nations Security Council. Now, a lot of Americans watching this unfold might say, okay, that's just diplomatic noise. Russia and China talk a big game. But here is where you have to slow down and look underneath the surface, because the substance of what is happening militarily and economically is far more alarming than the rhetoric. Russia's wartime conduct reinforced its role as one of Iran's most consequential external backers. While publicly positioning itself as a neutral mediator, Moscow simultaneously worked to sustain Iran's war effort. US officials say that Russia provided Iran with satellite imagery and other intelligence on the locations of American warships and aircraft in the region. Let that land. Russia was feeding real-time intelligence to Iran about where American ships and planes were operating. That is not diplomatic support. That is active participation in a conflict against American military assets. And if you think that does not constitute an act of war by any reasonable definition, then ask yourself, what would Washington say if Iran were feeding Russia live intelligence about American positions in Europe? The outrage would be immediate and total, but when it flows the other direction, it gets treated as background noise in a world that has grown numb to escalation. Moscow and Beijing have transitioned from diplomatic allies to technological anchors, providing Iran with advanced S-400 air defenses, Su-35 fighters, and Beidou-3 navigation to negate Western stealth and jamming capabilities. This is the real story inside the story. Iran did not face the most powerful military alliance in human history with its own hardware alone. It faced it with Russian eyes in the sky, Chinese navigation systems guiding its missiles, and a technological infrastructure that Beijing and Moscow spent years quietly building inside Iran's defense sector. In July 2025, just after the 12-day war, Iran received Chinese HQ-9B surface-to-air missile batteries, a long-range advanced air defense system. In December 2025, Iran reached a deal to purchase the Russian Verba shoulder-fired missile air defense system, including 500 launch units and 2,500 missiles. This was deliberate preparation. This was a buildup. And Washington watched it happen while negotiating, threatening, and ultimately choosing the military option. Now let's talk about the economics, because that is where this whole story gets even more uncomfortable for the American consumer and the American taxpayer. The Russian economy, battered by Western sanctions and the immense costs of the war in Ukraine, was facing a precarious 2026. Russia built its federal budget on oil price assumptions of roughly $60 a barrel. Instead, the eruption of war in the Gulf sent Brent crude surging toward $120 a barrel. This windfall rescued the Russian war budget, providing the Kremlin with the capital it needs to sustain its military operations in Europe. So here is the brutal arithmetic of what is happening. The United States went to war in the Middle East, and the single greatest financial beneficiary of that war is Russia. The Kremlin needed a lifeline, and America handed it one. Every gallon of gas that went up in price at your local pump in February and March 2026 was, in part, subsidizing Vladimir Putin's military machine in Ukraine. That is not opinion. That is the mechanical logic of global energy markets, and it is devastating. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz has wider implications, given nearly half of China's crude oil imports pass through it. Attacks on the Gulf states, who are vital to China's energy security, are similarly worrying for Beijing. And this is the paradox that Beijing finds itself navigating: a partner in trouble, strategic alignment to maintain, but also enormous economic interests in regional stability that direct military intervention would immediately destroy. China is playing a longer, slower, more patient game, but do not mistake patience for passivity. Intelligence assessments indicated Beijing prepared to offer financial aid and missile components while refraining from overt military involvement to safeguard its oil imports through contested waterways. Chinese radar systems and navigation technology exported pre-war enhanced Iran's electronic warfare capabilities. China armed Iran before the war, equipped it, built its eyes and ears, and then when the bombs fell, stepped back and said, "We support diplomacy. That is the most sophisticated form of warfare in the 21st century. You fight without fighting. You win without appearing to engage." And Washington, obsessed with kinetic power and carrier strike groups, still has not developed a coherent answer to it. For the United States and NATO partners, this trilateral pact raises the stakes in multiple regions. Any escalation with Iran now risks broader strategic responses involving Beijing and Moscow, increasing the threshold for conflict and reducing the effectiveness of unilateral threats. This is the architecture of deterrence being rebuilt from the outside in. For decades, America was the ultimate deterrent. You crossed a certain line, and the consequences were unthinkable. Now, Tehran watched what happened in Iraq. It watched Libya. It watched Afghanistan. And it decided the only real protection from American power was to bind itself so tightly to Beijing and Moscow that striking Iran would carry costs that extend far beyond the Middle East. That strategy, that particular gamble, is now being tested under live fire. And the results are complicated for everyone. Oman's foreign minister and lead mediator Badr bin Hamad al-Busaidi commented after the outbreak of hostilities in March 2026 that negotiations over the nuclear program had been making progress and continued that the US-Israeli war against Iran was solely an attempt to reorder the Middle East in Israel's favor. In a March 2026 opinion piece, al-Busaidi claimed the United States had lost control of its own foreign policy and accused Israel of persuading the Trump administration to engage in a war with Iran, which he termed a grave miscalculation and a catastrophe. The lead mediator of the talks, the man sitting in the room, saying publicly and plainly that diplomacy was working until it was deliberately derailed. That is not Iranian propaganda. That is Oman, a country that maintains one of the most careful, neutral diplomatic postures in the entire world, saying that something went catastrophically wrong in the decision-making process, and that the United States ended up serving interests that were not entirely its own. The December 2025 US national security strategy treats China and Russia in isolation, offering no strategy to keep them divided. And that is perhaps the single most damning sentence you will read about American grand strategy in a generation, because the entire intellectual foundation of American foreign policy since 1972 has been based on the idea that you keep Beijing and Moscow separated. You exploit the fractures between them. You make them compete with each other for American favor. Nixon understood it. Kissinger built a career on it. And the current strategic documents in Washington apparently abandoned it entirely, at precisely the moment when the consequences of that abandonment became most catastrophic. Over the last decade, Russia and China steadily expanded their influence in the Middle East through arms transfers, energy partnerships, and diplomatic initiatives. These efforts formed part of Moscow and Beijing's strategy to establish a multipolar order and anti-Western front. Yet the US-Israeli intervention in Iran has upended Middle Eastern geopolitics. Here is the thing that makes this so historically significant. The multipolar world that Russia and China have been talking about for 2 decades is no longer a theory. It is not a future aspiration. It is arriving messily and violently in real time. And the conflict in Iran is not a detour from that arrival. It is an accelerant. Every week this war continues. Every barrel of oil that spikes in price, every American asset that gets hit in the region, every diplomatic communique that Beijing and Moscow issue in coordinated harmony, all of it feeds the architecture of a world where Washington's unilateral power is being systematically eroded. Iran's nuclear program could still offer a path to de-escalation if the interim leadership agrees to grant international access to the Esfahan facility, where Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium is believed to be entombed since the 12-day war last June. But here is the profound tragedy buried inside all of this. The nuclear question, the original justification for everything, is now so entangled with regime change, with the assassination of the supreme leader, with the humiliation of a civilization that traces its history back 3,000 years, that de-escalation pathways that might have existed 6 months ago are now extraordinarily difficult to navigate. Because the United States has called for Iran's unconditional surrender, it will be politically difficult for Iran's leaders to come to the table without appearing to capitulate to US and Israeli pressure. You do not ask a society with that depth of historical memory and civilizational pride to simply surrender. The political cost of appearing to bow to Washington is higher than the cost of continued conflict. And that calculation is not irrational from Tehran's perspective. It is deeply, tragically human. When Iranian leaders assisted Russia's war on Ukraine by providing diplomatic support, ammunition, and thousands of lethal Shahed suicide drones, they probably believed Moscow would reciprocate by coming to their aid at a future time of need. And now they are watching Moscow mediate rather than mobilize. They are watching Beijing calculate rather than commit. Some contacts in Tehran have expressed a degree of frustration, and there had been an expectation that Russia should somehow do more than just diplomatic moves in the United Nations Security Council or in other multilateral forums. That gap between what Tehran expected and what Moscow delivered is one of the most important fault lines in this entire geopolitical picture. Because if Iran, after supplying Russia with drones and missiles for Ukraine, after signing the 20-year treaty, after anchoring itself to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS and everything else, if after all of that, Iran finds itself fighting essentially alone against the most powerful military on earth, then what does that say about the actual depth of the multipolar alliance? What does it say about the credibility of the alternative order that China and Russia have been promising the global South? These developments reveal that Russia and China's strategic partnerships with Iran amount to little more than non-binding forms of cooperation. Neither Moscow nor Beijing appear ready to escalate decisively to defend Iran. At best, they are pursuing a wait-and-see approach, banking on the United States becoming overextended. But the deeper question is whether the two states' influence in the region can survive. That is the question that will define the next 5 to 10 years. Because if the global South, the countries of Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, South Asia that have been watching this alliance take shape with genuine interest and cautious optimism, if they conclude that aligning with Beijing and Moscow offers no real security guarantee when the pressure comes, then the entire multipolar project loses its most important audience. The credibility deficit that comes from watching Iran absorb strikes while its partners issue statements is real, and it is cumulative. If Russia and China fail to move beyond technology transfers to active deterrence, they risk a credibility deficit that could signal the failure of the multipolar world order and alienate potential partners in the global south. And yet, and this is the part that Washington's most hawkish voices refuse to sit with, even in this constrained form, even with Russia and China choosing calculated restraint over direct intervention, the strategic damage to American power projection is profound and lasting. Russia is demonstrating that it can impose costs on the United States far beyond the borders of Ukraine. Beijing, meanwhile, is observing how United States carrier strike groups operate under fire, refining its own doctrines for potential conflicts in the Indo-Pacific. Every military lesson learned from this conflict is being absorbed by Chinese military planners thinking about Taiwan. Every American vulnerability exposed in the Persian Gulf is being cataloged in Beijing for future reference. The war in Iran is, from China's strategic perspective, the most valuable real-world military laboratory in a generation. The pact accelerates the multipolar restructuring of international relations. For decades, the United States and its allies dominated the architecture of global governance, from trade regimes to security pacts. A structured alignment of Iran, China, and Russia signifies an alternative axis that challenges Western hegemony not through ideological competition but through pragmatic power balances. That word, pragmatic, is the one that should stop you cold. Because this is not the Soviet Union. This is not communism versus capitalism. This is not an ideological crusade. This is three states with very different political systems, very different cultures, very different internal contradictions, finding sufficient common ground in their shared interest of not being dominated by Washington to build institutional frameworks of cooperation. And pragmatic alliances are in some ways more durable than ideological ones because they are not dependent on anyone believing the same things. They are only dependent on sharing the same enemy. Economically, the deal signals deeper integration among three of the world's most significant non-Western economies. Russia and China have already worked on investment protection and bilateral trade agreements designed to sidestep Western financial systems such as SWIFT. A trilateral pact potentially accelerates the creation of alternative financial mechanisms and trade routes that further bleed Western economic leverage. The dollar's role as the global reserve currency, SWIFT as the backbone of international financial transactions, these are not just economic abstractions. They are the instruments of American power that allow Washington to sanction, to pressure, to contain adversaries without firing a single shot. And every alternative financial corridor built between Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran, every oil trade settled in yuan or rubles, every new payment system that bypasses Western banking infrastructure chips away at the foundation of that power, not dramatically, not overnight, but relentlessly, structurally, and with a patience that spans decades rather than election cycles. What America is facing right now is not a single crisis. It is the simultaneous convergence of multiple crises. A war in the Middle East without a clear endgame, a Russian economy rescued by the very conflict Washington initiated, a Chinese military learning in real time from American combat operations, a trilateral strategic pact that institutionalizes the counter-architecture to Western dominance, and a global South watching carefully to decide which side of history offers them more security, more dignity, and more genuine partnership. The question is not whether the world is changing. The world has already changed. The question is whether Washington has the strategic clarity, the institutional wisdom, and the political courage to navigate a world it no longer unilaterally controls, before the cost of that navigation becomes unbearable for every ordinary American who never voted for empire, never asked for endless war, and never imagined that the decisions made in the corridors of power in Washington and Tel Aviv would one day reshape the planet they live on in ways none of them were ever prepared for.